Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We have been looking in this series at the cross question, and we have been looking over the last few weeks at whether or not the crucifixion as found in the Bible actually took place or not. And we've been looking at all the different issues that have led up to this point. Now, we are now dealing with the Passover banquet. This is the feast of Passover of unleavened bread that was only about 2 days off, when the Prophet Isa, peace be upon him, is on his way to Jerusalem. He's just outside Jerusalem. Jesus was at Bethany outside of Jerusalem in the house of Simon the leper. But John, who's writing much later than everybody else, he adds it into his version. And John, who is a true dramatist, he wants to make the story very different to everyone else. His story actually happened 6 days before the Passover, not 2 days like the Synoptic Gospels, right? So there's a 4-day difference between his story and the rest of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So John is very bad with mathematics, we said last week. In John's version, it says, a supper was given in his honor, in Jesus' honor, at which Martha served, and Lazarus sat amongst them as a guest with Jesus. Then Mary bought a pound of very costly perfume, pure oil of nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped them with her hair, till the house was so full of the aroma that Judas the Iscariot, one of the disciples who was there, the one who was going to betray Jesus, said, why waste this? Could have been sold for 30 pounds and given to the poor. So this is what we have got so far. And the verse continues to say that he did this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He used to steal the money and put it into his own purse from the common purse which he was in charge of. And Jesus then says to those people that were there, according to John, leave her alone. Let her keep doing what she is doing and keep what is left for my burial. This is found in John chapter 12, verse 2 to 7. So this is the story that we come up with. We see there's very big difference between the two accounts, and we'll go through them one by one. Now, John not only adds an extra 4 days, but he also adds more color to his story than we find in any of the other versions. Instead of Jesus just happening to be in Bethany, a proper formal supper is arranged for him, with many guests arranged to come and be there as VIPs. And the first VIP to come through the door, through the red carpet, is VIP Lazarus. And he is entrusted and thrust into the story as a kind of physical proof that there is going to be a resurrection. Almost as you would see in theater. You know, if you remember Punch and Judy shows, you'd have the children have Punch and Judy, those puppets, and you'd have that villain coming in every now and then, and all the children would shout, he's there, he's there, he's there. And often in Shakespearean plays, you'd see the villain coming in behind, and then the audience would know what's about to happen, but the actors were not sure what's going to happen. In many productions, you see this is commonplace, especially in theater, very common, dating back hundreds of years or even thousands of years. This was commonplace in theater. Now, Lazarus is thrust into the story as a kind of physical proof of the one who had been resurrected from the dead and who was now eating with Jesus, and proving that he was not just a ghost or an apparition or a spirit, but really a real person. So in a way, the audience is going to see this and going, we know what's coming. Jesus is going to die as well, and he's going to be resurrected as well, and he's going to eat food as well, just like Lazarus is doing all these things right now. So it's very unlikely that this happened, but this is the only person who records such elaborate incidents with all these extra characters being added in. But also, the next VIP to enter into this banquet is Martha. And Martha is the one who's doing the serving. So she has to play front and center. His sister has to play front and center as the guest in this scenario. And the woman who brings in the perfume, anoints his head in the story, is none other than Mary, another VIP, a guest. And so we find that all the other accounts, none of them remember these VIP. They were celebrities of the day. No one would have forgotten Martha, no one would have forgotten Lazarus, and no one, for sure, would have forgotten Mary. But none of these other writers somehow remember that these three extremely important VIPs were there. So in the account given by John, she brings in a very costly or very large bottle, in fact, a pound of very costly perfume. Where we find in the other account, it is a very small bottle. There's a big difference between a large bottle and a small bottle. I mean, if you're a purchaser, a person going to buy a liter of cold drink and you only get 255 milliliters of cold drink, you're going to be very upset. You're going to say you've been ripped off, you've been crooked. And so there's a difference between the two. I mean, we're not so stupid as that we wouldn't know, and they can say, well, one person didn't notice how big it was. She does not pour the oil onto Jesus' hair, as according to the synoptic gospel writers, but she does anoint his feet and wipes it with her own hair. So the story is a big difference between washing his hair or washing his feet. Her pound of oil should have come very, very handy on the day when she would prepare for Jesus' burial, but somehow we never hear of that oil again. I mean, what's the purpose of even bringing the story into the Bible? It doesn't really make any sense of having it in the first place. There'd be a lot more interesting things that we could account for. So there's not much thought that goes behind why these things are actually even put in there. As for those who were angry at the waste, according to John, it was only Judas the Iscariot that was angry at the problem of being wasting all this perfume. He was the person who was the treasurer, the person who held the common purse. It's interesting, it was Judas. If Judas was supposedly this criminal mind, the mastermind, the thief that he was supposed to be, as John wants the reader to believe, then he must have been the worst thief in the world, because his bargaining skills were terrible. First of all, he sells Jesus to the Jews for only getting 30 pieces of silver, rather than keeping Jesus alive and keep skimming the money off them, out of Jesus, keeping him alive, because if you think of him being alive, he would have made him a lot more money than 30 pieces of silver if he was supposedly, as John says, a thief. By keeping Jesus alive, he could have continuously had an income by stealing money off the purse or out of the purse of their common treasury. So it was in his best interest as a thief to keep Jesus alive, not to have him killed. So he is a terrible thief, and he has a very, very bad business skills. Now, on the day of unleavened bread, the disciples arranged a meeting place according to the instructions Jesus has given them. So they have to have a special place that they must meet. And this we find in Mark chapter 14, verse 18 to 20. As they sat at the supper table, Jesus said to them, and I quote you the following, he says, "I tell you this, one of you who will betray me, the one who eats with me, is the one of the 12 of you who dips into this bowl with me now." So this is the story that we are told according to Mark chapter 14, 18 to 20. Interesting, the same time that we hear this story, each gospel writer will add his own bits and pieces into it. He adds his own masala, his own spices, his own flavors into it. Each time the passage is written, the verses are added into. We don't find the same thing ever being spoken by all of them. They all speak in divided voices. According to Mark, the 12, one by one, said to him, all 12 of them that were there, said one by one, "Surely it's not I," or "Not I, surely." But according to Matthew, it was Judas who was sitting there, and he asked, "Rabbi, can you mean me?" And Jesus replied and said, "The words are yours," as you'll find in Matthew chapter 26, verse 25. To Luke, who aims his writing to the non-Jews, this is a waste of time, for the stage has already been set, the destiny has already been destined, and everything is already in place. So he doesn't even bother with any of this. Jesus states that this is just one of the things that must happen, according to Luke chapter 22, verse 15, where it says, "How I long to eat the Passover with you before my death." So Jesus states his discourse by simply saying, "How I wish I could have eaten my Passover with you before my death." Nothing dramatic, nothing elaborate, no big banquets, no washing of feet and all this other stuff. That's very, very simple. Like something out of a Shakespeare play, John does not just leave it there. He does his best to outdo anyone else. If you said it's like this, I've got to make it better. If you said there are 10 people, I've got to make 100 people. So he must outdo the person. Again, this is not something that would have been typical for the general person to do, unless it's got the fingerprint of Paul. And remember, Paul has got an agenda. He's trying to outdo the other disciples to show that he was a better servant. He was a better minister than they were. So John would not have Jesus stating such an important meeting so unceremoniously. You know, John doesn't want Jesus just going to a banquet, We must have this meeting before I get handed over to. No, John must have a very, very big banquet. Everything has to be abnormally big and blown up. As soon as everyone is seated, we have the story of Jesus here. Jesus rose from the table, laid aside his garment, and taking a towel, tied it around himself. Then he poured water in a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and wiping them with a towel. John chapter 13, verse 4 and 5. So we see that he has to make this whole big thing. I mean, he has to exaggerate it as far as he could possibly go. Now, Paul hesitates, then realizes the honor, asking Jesus to wash his feet and head as well. And Jesus in the story tells him, and I quote to you, it says, "You are clean, though not every one of you." He added these words, "not every one of you," because he knew that there was going to be one of them who was going to betray him. John chapter 13, verse 10 and 11. So John keeps reassuring us what is going to happen and that Jesus is actually the Son of God. He keeps bringing all this stuff in. But we have to take a break. When we get back from the break, we'll continue inshallah. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back. We are dealing with the cross question, but we are looking at the issues leading up to the crucifixion, and we're investigating stage by stage every single point as we go along. And we've just quoted that verse from John chapter 13, verse 10 and 11, where it says, "It's not every one of you," because he knew that one of them that was there was going to betray him. He's talking about the Last Supper, the banquet that they're having. And this is John's version. John keeps reassuring us so that we do not get the idea that the Son of God did not know what was going to happen. So John keeps telling us every time he mentions something, he has to explain it to us as if we are stupid. So he says, when Jesus said, "One of you is not clean," what he meant is one of those people there were going to betray him. He knew one of them was going to betray him. So he has to make Jesus out to be more than just a human being, more than just a prophet. He has to be someone who was unable to know everything that was going to happen before it happened. But this brings up a lot of problems later, as we will see. Because if he did know everything that was going to happen, why did he do half the things that he did? But we will see that later as we get there. He keeps hammering home the idea that Jesus knew all along all that was going to happen to him and who it was that would betray him. So this is the idea that John has to push into the reader's minds every time he speaks. Earlier, he had written in John chapter 6, verse 70 and 71, "Yet one of you is a devil," and he meant Judas. So this is what he accordingly says in John chapter 6, verse 70 and 71. Now, while the synoptic gospels, or the three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, they are quite happy to say one of the 12, John must elaborate. And he says, one of them, the disciple he loved, was reclining. Ask, who is it that Jesus means? And that disciple, the one who Jesus loved, leaned close to Jesus and asked Jesus, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus replied, "The man who I give this piece of bread and dips it into the dish with me." John chapter 13, verse 26 onwards. Now, there's a few things before we move any further. This is a very, very interesting piece of literature, because who is this person whom Jesus loved? I mean, we'd love to know who this person is, because there's this mysterious line that keeps coming up in John. It says here, the disciple leaned over who was reclining onto Jesus. So you've got this idea that there's one person that is very, very, very close to Jesus. Very, very close. In fact, the verse says, one of them, the disciple he loved, was reclining close to Jesus. So you got this idea of almost leaning into him. You know when you got your bestest friend, maybe those who are young will know this, your bestest friend, he leans into you the whole time. It's just like, I can't stay away from you for 2 seconds. That's what it's like. You got that impression in your mind. But this is not the case. And ask him who Jesus meant. So he asked this disciple whom Jesus loved. I'm sure most of you have figured out who this disciple is whom Jesus loved. It's John himself. So John there's nothing wrong with John. He's not embarrassed about anything. He writes himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, the disciple whom he loved, all the time. And you'll see this happens not once or twice, it happens often. I mean, there's no embarrassment in this guy. I mean, even if you were like that, even if, say you were the favorite person of whoever it is that you like, you would not write yourself and say, I was the #1 fan, because people will think you're a bit crazy. They'll think you're a stalker. You know? So this is the way that we find the writing of the New Testament. Very, very strange. It's not the way that should be written. Now, according to John, Satan entered into Judas as soon as he received the bread. Remember, Jesus said, the one that I dip this bread and give it to, that's the one who will betray me. Now, according to John, Satan entered into Judas as soon as he received that bread. And you can read this in John chapter 18, verse 27. Now, here is a big contradiction in itself. As he had already stated before the Passover, John has already stated before the Passover in John chapter 2, Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot, to betray him. Read it for yourself, John chapter 13, verse 2. But according to verse 18, it is only when he dips in the bread. So the story doesn't gel together. There's always a problem with the story of the betrayal, especially when it comes to John's version. John's version seldom agrees with the rest of the story that we find in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. In fact, we have already made the conspiracy theory exposed, because he likes to add in all these strange extra people that are actually not necessary for the storyline, like by adding in Lazarus and Mary and all these other people. So the fact that he's already made this story the chief part of the story shows that he's trying to maybe make his book more acceptable than those of the other writers. There's a reason behind this. Now, the betrayal had already taken place, supposedly. If we read Mark chapter 14, verse 11, Matthew chapter 26, verse 16, Luke chapter 22, verse 6, they tell us that Jesus was going to be arrested, that he was going to be taken over without collecting a crowd, because they wanted to do this without having a big fuss. So if we read the story about how Jesus was to be betrayed, we don't see this big issue of guards coming in the middle of the night and attacking them. They wanted to do this in a very quiet way, away from all the crowd. So when we look at the story that has been given to us, the story that is given to us in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, even though they have huge amounts of errors and problems in it, they're not as problematic as John. Because John has the idea of everything being over-dramatized. Everything must be done publicly, noisily, big. Now, earlier the chief priests and Pharisees had convened a meeting of the council, or the Sanhedrin as it's called, to decide what actions are to be taken. And they said, this man has performed many signs and many miracles. If we leave him alone like that, the whole populace will believe in him and will start following him. So this was the fear that the chief priests and the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin had. Then the Romans, according to the Bible, it says the Pharisees and the Sadducees were afraid, because they were afraid that the Romans would come and sweep away the temples and will take away nations. But then one of those priests that were there said, you don't even know what you're talking about, you don't understand what you're talking about, but you do not judge properly. He goes into this whole dialogue. He says, let's rather have it that one man should die for the people, so that the whole nation should not be destroyed. And this is all found in a long dialogue. So that's just paraphrasing the whole thing. You know nothing whatever, says this one high priest. You do not use judgment. It is more of interest that one man should die for the people than that the whole nation be destroyed. You hear the dramatic way that he uses language. And so you have this story of the way that the spirit of prophecy will suddenly be thrown in, and how the story, what the actual true story is, we'll never know, because there's so much extra masala being added into the story. We battle to actually see what the actual story was that was being told. And true to himself, here we go again, John brings in his supposed spirit of prophecy. Is the only person that we see all the time bringing in the spirit of prophecies compared to all the others, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So in John chapter 11, verse 51 and 52, it says the following: "He did not say this of his own account, but as the high priest in office of that year, he was prophesying that Jesus would die for the nation." So John likes to throw in as much as he can spirit of prophecy wherever possible. At this point, he must have realized that this might not be the right time to bring this in, because there was a Jewish nation that was busy growing. At this point, he must have realized he had to include also the Gentiles while he was writing for the Gentiles as well, Gentiles being non-Jews. So he smartly adds in this extra line: "But would die not for the nation alone, but to gather together the scattered children of God." Very convenient, well saved, good little put in there. In other words, he was implying not just the lost sheep of the house of Israel, as Jesus himself had said, but also for all nations as well. Up till now, Jesus had been careful not to give any opportunity for the direct confrontation, or at least to give himself any unnecessary trouble. So he had left Nazareth to protect himself so that they wouldn't have problems there. He had left Judea and traveled to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. He had kept his plans to visit Jerusalem secret. He even went as far as not telling his own brothers where he was going, so that everything would be fine. He was careful that when he went to Jerusalem, that he did it at night. Everything that he did in caution, so that he wouldn't be in danger up to this point. And this was all done in a very, very careful, well planned out, well done way. And so we find it a bit difficult now, because what we're going to be looking at next, it sort of contradicts this whole carefulness, this making sure he travels at night, making sure his disciples don't know too much information. So he carefully went into Jerusalem every night so that he couldn't be arrested or wouldn't be into any problem. Now we have a problem coming up, because it is very intriguing what happens next. And I'm not going to go into details now, but something very strange happened, something very different. We've seen how cautious he's been. And suddenly, he's not so cautious. So what I want you to do is, if you haven't seen the previous episodes, I want you to try and get hold of copies of it. You can get it from Peace TV. Or you can wait for the transcript to be made available, and you can get the transcript of it, and then you're able to see what we've been doing in the series so far. It's very, very important that if you have been watching, that you've been taking notes, and that you know what's happening, so that when you go into the next episode, you know what's going on. So from me, Areeb Islam, till next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.